June 7th, 1944. 07:23 hours. Carentan, Normandy. Rain drifted across the ruined town like thin smoke, a mist too light to fall properly and too wet to ignore. It clung to uniforms, soaked web gear, and turned the broken cobblestones slick under worn jump boots. The sky had not yet decided whether the day was beginning or ending. The clouds sat low and pale, like damp wool pulled across the rooftops. In the direction of the bay, artillery thundered, slow and distant. Here, inside a cramped French courtyard, the war was closer. It roared in short, savage bursts from an MG-42, somewhere behind sandbags and shattered glass. The courtyard was barely wide enough for a squad to move without stepping on rubble. A stone archway less than 30 feet across served as the only entrance. The walls were older than the country the paratroopers came from, thick 17th century masonry built for a war no one remembered. The Germans had founded a perfect fortress. One machine gun covered the archway. Riflemen held the windows above. Their fields of fire overlapped, intersected, and left no blind spots. Anyone who stepped through the arch lasted seconds, maybe less. The courtyard wasn't ground to capture. It was a trap. The soldiers pressed against the archway were from different companies of the 106th and 105th. They had been scattered across the countryside in the early hours after their jump. Some had landed in flooded marshes. Others spent the night trying to find their way through hedgerows that all looked the same in darkness. Now they were together, united not by command, but by circumstance, exhausted, hungry, and nearly out of ammunition. They had not slept since the night of June 5th. They carried what they had managed to pick up along the way: foreign rifles, German ammo pouches, weapons looted from dead men who no longer needed them. The first attempt to clear the courtyard came at 06:54 hours. A fire team tried to rush through the arch on the left side, hugging the wall, hoping to get close enough to throw grenades into the lower windows. They did not make it past 10 feet. The MG-42 burned through 5-second bursts, cutting them down so quickly the men behind them did not even realize they had fallen until the gun stopped. The bodies lay in the rain, one face down in a puddle, the other folded under the arch as if kneeling in prayer. The second attempt happened 10 minutes later. A squad split into two groups, one aiming to draw fire from the right, while the other threw fragmentation grenades toward the courtyard. The plan died before the grenades landed. The riflemen above had angles the Americans hadn't accounted for. A single shot from one window hit the man carrying the grenades. The blast killed him and wounded two others, scattering shrapnel and smoke around the entrance. Once again, the MG-42 spoke, short and exact, disciplined and merciless. Now only 7 men remained under the archway. Their faces were gray from exhaustion, their eyes red from the rain and smoke. No one spoke loudly. No one shouted orders. They simply watched the opening into the courtyard with the same expression. Something between fear and calculation. They were not pinned by numbers. They were pinned by geometry. A sergeant from Fox Company pressed his back against the wall and wiped his face with the sleeve of his jacket. Though it made no difference. He was still wet. "We push again. We die," he muttered, voice flat. There was no debate. It was a statement, not an opinion. Another paratrooper, his helmet tilted back slightly to relieve the pressure of a bleeding scalp, checked his remaining ammunition. 4 mags, he said quietly. And that's if they don't jam. He looked toward the courtyard as if it might answer him. A mortar corporal shook his head. "No angle. Can't drop one in there without bouncing it off the roof." His voice had no frustration in it, only resignation. For a moment, The courtyard fell silent except for the whisper of rain and the faint echo of distant gunfire from some other part of Carentan. The Germans were not wasting ammo. They did not need to. They had the advantage. They could wait. Among the 7 men crouched under the archway was a private who had said almost nothing since dawn. He stood slightly apart from the others, close enough to hear, far enough to think. His name was Private First Class Eldon Harris. The others called him Dusty, though no one seemed to know why. He wasn't looking at the courtyard the way the others did. His eyes weren't searching for movement or muzzle flashes. He was studying the air itself. Rain drifted into the courtyard and swirled strangely, rising for a moment near the left wall, then flattening out against the cobblestones. The mist didn't move straight up. It curled, pushed sideways, bounced off the old stone like breath hitting cold glass. Dusty's gaze tracked it carefully, following how the moisture gathered in corners and clung to edges. The others watched the danger. Harris watched the conditions that shaped it. His hand rested on a single M18 smoke grenade hanging from his harness. He had taken it because no one else wanted to carry the extra weight. Smoke was considered useless in close quarters. In tight spaces, smoke made you blind long before it blinded the enemy. That was what they had been taught. That was what every sergeant and every field manual insisted. Harris rolled the grenade in his hand slowly, feeling the metal grow colder in the morning air. The rain lifted in a faint draft. The mist twisted upward and then back down. Harris narrowed his eyes. Something was off. Something was different. He whispered to himself, barely audible beneath the dripping uniforms and the distant rumble of shells. Updraft's wrong here. No one heard him. No one asked. The courtyard remained a perfect trap. The archway remained a tomb, waiting for another body. The Germans waited. The Americans waited. And Private Harris, holding a grenade no one wanted, stared into the swirling air as though it were telling him a secret no one else could see. The archway did not look dangerous. That was the first lie. The opening was wide enough to fit a wagon, high enough for 2 men to run through without ducking. On any normal day, it would have invited traffic. Today, it invited death. Beyond it, the courtyard stretched only a short distance, no more than 30 paces across. But the space was arranged like a funnel, wide enough to enter and far too narrow to survive. The stone floors were old, smooth and wet, glistening faintly under the washed-out light. Every angle favored the defenders. Every step inside was exposed. The Germans had chosen their positions with cruel precision. An MG-42 sat behind a small barricade of sandbags built into the far wall. Its barrel pointed directly toward the archway. The machine gunner did not need to aim. He merely needed to maintain discipline. Short, controlled bursts, enough to cut down anything that moved. The gun's cyclic rate was legendary among the Americans. 1,200 rounds per minute if the trigger was held. Yet the German gunner never wasted ammunition. He fired in deliberate pulses. 5 seconds, pause, another 5 seconds. The air did not ring with chaos. It pulsed with execution. Above the courtyard, windows framed riflemen who barely revealed themselves. Some lay hidden behind furniture dragged into firing positions. Others knelt behind sandbags at second-story angles, where even a small movement of the American helmet would bring a shot. The overlapping fields of fire eliminated any dead ground. The enemy did not simply shoot down into the courtyard. They shot across it, diagonally, stitching lines where no one could crawl, run, or even take cover. Standard infantry tactics offered nothing useful. Smoke, as every sergeant repeated, was a liability indoors. In the open field, smoke could provide concealment as wind carried it across the landscape. But inside enclosed spaces, urban streets, alleys, tight squares like this one, smoke tended to backfire. It would drift toward the friendlies, billow into their path, and blind them before obscuring the enemy. Every training manual warned the same thing. Never throw smoke where your own line of movement is narrow. In a confined approach, the soldier who could not see would die long before the one who was waiting for him. Fragmentation grenades had already proven useless. The courtyard's walls were too thick, too high. Grenades blew upward and outward, not directly into the sandbagged machine gun nest. The paratroopers had tried dropping grenades near the archway, hoping shrapnel might bounce toward the gunner. The result left small chips in the old stone and nothing more. One corporal tried to lob a grenade high, hoping to arc it into one of the windows. The angle was too steep. It bounced off the building and landed in the open, killing him before the explosion even cleared the courtyard. The platoon had no bazookas. Their mortar section could not get a clean trajectory. No tanks could reach them through the narrow streets, not yet. Reinforcements were pinned as well, scattered across Carentan, each fighting the same kind of slow, grinding battle for alleys and crossroads. Requests for artillery were pointless. The courtyard was too close to friendly positions. A shell might kill the machine gun, but it would also kill everyone under the archway. The fortress had been built by men who designed walls to withstand cannons. 17th century vision had outsmarted 20th century weapons. The paratroopers were not failing because they lacked courage or numbers. They were failing because the structure itself turned courage into waste. The town around them was collapsing. Floors blown open, roofs shattered, windows shattered into serrated black holes. Yet this one building remained stubbornly intact. Its walls were thick enough to anchor German defenses. Its courtyard was the perfect choke point. Even the rain assisted the defenders, softening boot soles, dulling American movement, and creating reflective sheen that betrayed any slight step. The 7 surviving paratroopers stared into the courtyard, each seeing death arranged with architectural precision. The sergeant leaned harder against the wall. "They built this place to stop cannonballs," he muttered under his breath. "And damned if it isn't still doing it." A man beside him exhaled softly, rubbing mud from his rifle grip. Another shook his head and whispered, "We need armor." No one laughed. Armor was not coming. Armor could not fit through the narrow streets clogged with rubble and twisted hedgerows. The rain thickened slightly, turning from mist to scattered droplets. They fell into the courtyard, and immediately the wind pushed them toward the center, where they vanished into faint vapor rising from the cold stone. Dusty Harris watched again. Not the walls, not the gun, but the movement of moisture in the air. He traced the path of every swirl as if it were a map no one else could read. The courtyard was not just a kill zone. It was a sealed chamber where air behaved differently. The others saw a fortress they could not enter. Harris saw conditions he did not yet understand, and the M18 smoke grenade at his side, dismissed, unwanted, useless, suddenly felt heavier, not from weight, but from possibility. Private First Class Eldon Harris did not look like the kind of man who belonged in a firefight in northern France. He was not particularly imposing. No one remembered him being the loudest in training or the quickest in drills. His helmet sat a little crooked. His face never lost the tired expression of someone who had worked long hours doing something repetitive and dull. If anything about him stood out, it was how long he could stare at something without speaking. Men assumed he was slow. In truth, he was thinking. Before he volunteered for the airborne, Harris worked at a mill in Youngstown, Ohio, 1942. Long before he ever carried a rifle, he stood over industrial ducts and conveyor fans that sucked airborne dust away from furnaces. His job was simple: monitor airflow systems that captured iron filings, cinders, and flakes shaved from glowing metal as presses stamped and cut machinery parts. 8 hours a day, 6 days a week, he watched hot air and debris swirl through steel chambers shaped like boxes, transitions, and vents. The mill foreman never noticed that Harris paid more attention to the air than to the metal. While other men complained about burns and heat, Dusty studied turbulence. He watched how hot air rose too quickly if a valve opened wrong, how dust collected in corners if a pipe bent at the wrong angle. He noticed how certain temperatures kept smoke flat, hugging the bottom of a chamber before rising slowly, forming cloud-like shapes that moved sideways, then upward. He learned where air wanted to travel. He learned that flow could be predicted by shape, heat, and containment. He did not know the equations. He did not need them. The mill workers teased him, called him Dusty, because his clothes always smelled faintly of metal powder even after washing. The nickname stuck, not because it was clever, but because he never protested it. Dusty Harris accepted what people called him, just as he accepted long nights of shifts, repeated tasks, and pay that barely covered rent. But he carried something with him. An instinctive understanding of movement in closed spaces, how pressure and heat shaped air, how smoke behaved around walls. When he enlisted in the Army, he expected no one to care about that, and no one did. In basic training, instructors valued loud confidence and fast reactions far more than quiet observation. Dusty was not slow intellectually. He was slow verbally. He took a moment to think before answering questions. That earned him extra push-ups and criticism. "Harris, you trying to figure out the meaning of life?" one drill sergeant barked. "Speak up before the Germans win the war." Dusty answered quietly. The sergeant shouted anyway. At jump school, he learned how to fall, how to check equipment, how to land without breaking bones. He learned quick reflexes the hard way. One misstep in a parachute harness nearly dislocated his shoulder. But he also noticed small things others ignored. He watched how parachutes drifted differently in morning humidity versus afternoon wind. He noticed how smoke from signal flares behaved differently when trapped between hangars. Another recruit asked him once how he seemed to know when crosswinds were about to hit. Dusty shrugged. "Feels like a change in the air," he said. The man laughed and walked away. In the hungry months before D-Day, while other paratroopers joked, complained, or gambled to pass time, Harris found himself staring at smoke, steam, and wind again. Men teased him for being distracted, but he was not distracted. He was practicing, even if he didn't know why. He carried the smoke grenade because someone else didn't want it. The platoon sergeant had tossed a handful of M18 canisters onto a makeshift table, muttering about extra useless weight. The grenades rolled near men sorting their ammo and gear. One man picked one up, frowned, and set it down. Another pushed two away, saying he already had too much to carry. Dusty spoke only once. "I'll take it," he said. No one argued. No one asked why. They had jumped into Normandy on the night of June 5th. It was chaos. Harris landed in a flooded field, half submerged, coughing muddy water as he struggled to unfasten his chute. Gunfire cracked in the distance. He pulled himself onto dry ground and spent hours moving alone, guided by the moon and occasional tracer fire. He linked up with 2 paratroopers near dawn, then 3 more near a hedgerow. They formed a makeshift squad by necessity, not by command. Dusty followed along, rifle ready, rarely speaking. But his eyes scanned buildings, windows, sight lines, though not for enemies alone. He watched where smoke from burning haylofts drifted, how it hugged low places, how it pooled in bomb craters before climbing. By the evening of June 6th, he had been in 2 firefights. He was not the first to shoot, nor the last. What men noticed was how he chose where to stand. While others hugged random walls or rushed ahead blindly, Dusty seemed to step instinctively into positions that gave him partial cover from multiple angles. No one remarked on it. They assumed he was lucky. Dusty assumed the others were not thinking enough. Now, standing under the archway of that courtyard in Carentan, he felt the same instinct return, stronger than ever. The rain and mist did not simply fall, they reacted. They moved strangely, swirling low before lifting, then being pushed sideways. Dusty did not know the exact reason, but he had seen similar patterns in mill vents when heat mixed with cold drafts inside containment ducts. The heavy stone walls around the courtyard held colder air. The rain hit the warmer cobblestones and turned into vapor rising too slowly to escape. The courtyard was not breathing like a street. It was breathing like a furnace box. Dusty did not think of science, diagrams, or theory. He simply saw a confined chamber where smoke would behave differently than training manuals claimed. He saw opportunity where others saw blindness. He gripped the M18 grenade more tightly, feeling its ridged casing cold against his palm. Behind him, the sergeant muttered again about armor that would never come. Dusty stared into the courtyard and whispered his first true thought aloud. If smoke stays low, we stay alive. Rain pattered against helmets and web gear, steady but thin, more like sweat from the sky than weather. The courtyard waited, silent, a stone throat ready to swallow anyone foolish enough to step inside. The 7 paratroopers remained under the archway, pressed so close to the wall they could feel the cold of centuries in the rock. They had no plan. They had no orders. They had only the math written in dead bodies on the cobblestones. The MG-42 would not miss a third time. The platoon sergeant checked his watch, though there was nothing to time. His jaw clenched and unclenched as if chewing invisible food. We'll wait for a distraction. Maybe tanks get through. Maybe someone flanks them. The men listened because that was what soldiers did. Listen when someone with stripes spoke. They nodded out of habit, not hope. Dusty Harris stood apart by inches. It was enough. From there, he could see the mist crawling along the cobblestones like fog on a cold river. It gathered at the lowest point of the courtyard near the center, then drifted upward in a slow, confused swirl. The draft near the archway was weak, not strong enough to pull the moisture outward. The shape of the courtyard trapped everything: sound, bullets, and air. Harris raised the smoke grenade and felt its weight settle in his hand. The ridged casing was cold from rain, but dry where his palm pressed. The pin loop touched his knuckle. He spoke quietly, barely above the rain's whisper. "We're not waiting." The sergeant turned. His response came instinctively. "Private, you do nothing until I say you do something." His voice was sharp, not angry, just rigid, like a rule written on a wall. Dusty met his eyes, not with defiance, but certainty. If we throw smoke high, it blows back at us. They see first. We die first. He pointed toward the far wall where the mist rose only halfway before flattening. If we throw low, the walls hold it. One of the riflemen scoffed under his breath. "Smoke gets everyone killed indoors." It was not argument. It was doctrine. Harris shook his head. "Not if the smoke sits where they can't see to shoot." The sergeant exhaled hard, almost a laugh, almost a warning. "And how in hell do you know that?" Dusty did not explain the mill, the ducts, the furnace vents, the years spent watching smoke behave like water in metal chambers. He did not explain why the courtyard reminded him of containment boxes. He did not need to. He only said, Watch the rain. He pointed with the grenade, not like a teacher, just a man stating fact. The others looked. Most saw nothing. The sergeant saw just enough. The mist was not floating up and away. It was pooling, waiting. The courtyard acted like a bowl. Dusty pulled the grenade's pin with a slow, deliberate motion. The click of metal was louder than the rain. The men stiffened. The sergeant's voice cut sharply. "Don't you throw that in the open. You blind us, I'll—" Dusty interrupted, his tone even and quiet. "I'm not throwing it far. I'm skipping it. Skipping it." The phrase struck the group strangely. A fragmentation grenade you threw, an incendiary you tossed, a smoke grenade you usually lobbed high. But skipping one, like a stone across water, made no sense. Dusty crouched and held the smoke canister low, almost touching the stones. If it bounces shallow, it bursts flat. It hugs the ground. Smoke rises slow if it's cold and trapped. He did not raise his voice. He did not try to convince them. He simply described what would happen. The sergeant stared at him for 2 long seconds, then looked at the courtyard. 2 men had died there without firing a shot. The math had not changed. Doing nothing was as deadly as doing something stupid. He swore under his breath. "Fine, you get 1 chance. 30 seconds. After that, we charge or fall back." He turned to the others. "Get ready. The second that gun's blind, we move." They checked rifles, tightened slings, and shifted weight forward. No speeches. No rallying words. They were past that. Dusty rolled the smoke grenade once in his palm, then held it sideways like a skipping stone. He aimed not at the gunner, not at the center, but at a wet patch of cobblestone just inside the archway. Slick, angled, perfect. He let the grenade fall from his hand, gave it a short forward tap with his fingers, and sent it spinning low across the ground. It hit the wet stone, skipped an inch, bounced again, and rolled until it kissed the center of the courtyard. It detonated with a muted chuff, not loud, not dramatic, just release. White smoke sprayed out sideways, not upward. It spread across the stones like a flood. It did not rise fast. It clung low, thickening near the center before blooming outward. Within seconds, the courtyard floor was no longer visible. The windows began to cloud. The machine gun nest blurred. The sergeant's eyes widened. Holy hell. It's holding. The smoke thickened further as heat from the stones pushed upward into the expanding cloud. Instead of lifting out of the courtyard, it bounced high, hit the cold air above, and crashed back down like fog in reverse. The defender's line of sight vanished. The MG-42 barked a long burst blindly, but the bullets tore uselessly into smoke. Dusty's voice was calm, almost gentle. "We go before they adjust." The sergeant nodded once, sharply. "Everyone, on me." 7 paratroopers leaned forward into the unknown, rifles ready, hearts steady because visibility had flipped sides. The courtyard that killed everything now hid them completely, and the grenade no one wanted had just given them 30 seconds to change the battle. They stepped into the smoke. The clock had begun. The smoke did not roar or surge like ammunition or fire. It moved quietly, thickening in layers, each breath of it folding into the courtyard like damp cloth. The paratroopers stepped into the cloud, and the world vanished. There was no horizon, no depth, no walls, only a shifting white veil that smelled faintly of chemicals and wet stone. The MG-42 fired again, but the shot had doubt in it. The rounds tore across the courtyard at chest height, but there was no adjustment. The German gunner had lost his targets. Dusty Harris was now just another silhouette swallowed by the white. He could see no more than 3 feet ahead. He did not try to see farther. He kept his rifle tight, finger near the trigger guard, not on it. The sergeant's voice came as a low whisper somewhere ahead. "Move fast, stay low. Follow my boots if you can." Boots. It was a ridiculous instruction inside a cloud, but it made sense. The stone beneath them was slick, but the smoke lay thickest near the ground. Shapes were barely visible there. The sergeant crouched and moved. The others followed, hunched low, rifles angled outward, eyes squinting through what looked like milky fog. The courtyard distorted sound. Footsteps echoed strangely, bouncing off walls and fading too quickly. Somewhere above, a German shouted in clipped, uncertain tones. Another yelled a command, muffled by panic. They expected to see targets. They saw nothing. The MG-42 opened up again, longer this time, desperate. It rattled like tearing fabric. But there was no way to track movement, no silhouettes to follow. The gunner had become as blind as the men he hunted. 12 seconds had passed. The paratroopers were halfway across the courtyard. A rifleman to Dusty's left tripped on debris. An unexploded grenade dropped in the earlier chaos. He crashed to one knee. Dusty caught his arm, steadied him, and whispered, "Forward." No one else heard. They did not need to. They kept going. 15 seconds. The sergeant stopped suddenly and crouched lower. Dusty felt his boot brush something solid. Sandbags. They had reached the MG nest. The fog above the bags thinned enough to expose a faint dark shape. The muzzle of the MG-42 pointed straight ahead, still firing blind. The gunner had no idea they were beneath him. The sergeant made a small gesture with his fingers, no words. He pointed right. 2 paratroopers pivoted, raising their rifles low, ready for any flanking movement. He pointed left. Another 2 covered the angle. Then, he pointed straight at Dusty. Dusty understood. They had not rehearsed it. They did not need to. 17 seconds. Dusty stepped up on the sandbag, as silently as wet stone allowed. The smoke around the machine gunner had thinned just enough for Dusty to see the German's helmet and the outline of his shoulders. The gunner was fixated on the far side of the courtyard, convinced his bullets were still keeping enemies pinned at the arch. Dusty placed his rifle barrel 3 inches from the gunner's chest, just left of the spine, beneath the shoulder. He pressed the trigger once. Controlled, not panicked. A single round. The German collapsed forward without even turning his head. 19 seconds. The assistant gunner turned, startled, fumbling for a weapon. Before he lifted it, the sergeant was over the sandbag, driving a short burst from his M1 into the man's chest and throat. The assistant dropped sideways, dead weight falling into the smothered cloud. 21 seconds. From above came the distinct metallic click of rifle bolts. The Germans in the windows could no longer rely on machine gun cover. They were preparing to shoot anything that moved. The sergeant grabbed the MG-42 and yanked it sideways, pointing it upward at the windows. "Spot and fire," he whispered. Dusty braced the weapon as the sergeant squeezed the trigger. The gun roared with violent clarity, carving arcs across the second floor. Germans in the windows ducked away, some firing blindly in return. One figure slumped across a windowsill, arms dangling. 25 seconds. The paratroopers not engaged with the MG nest began throwing fragmentation grenades into the courtyard's corners, not toward enemies, but toward likely cover spots and doorways. They counted to 2, not 3. The grenades detonated, shredding empty cover or killing those hidden there. Dusty could not see the kills, but he heard the screams cut short. 27 seconds. A shadow moved near the left flank. A German rifle cracked through the fog. The round grazed the sergeant's sleeve and ricocheted off stone. Dusty and two others reacted immediately, firing into the moving silhouette. The figure collapsed, sliding against the courtyard wall without fully revealing his face. 30 seconds. The smoke began to thin slightly at the edges. The sergeant raised a fist and hissed, "Inside! Move!" The paratroopers vaulted over the sandbags and spilled into the building interior through a broken doorway behind the machine gun nest. The Germans inside were still disoriented, coughing, trying to adjust to the choking air. The Americans did not give them time. The courtyard was no longer a trap. It was a breach. 30 seconds of blindness had allowed 7 men to shatter a fortress designed to kill entire platoons. And Dusty Harris, without shouting, without rank, had changed the balance of the fight with one grenade thrown 3 inches off the ground. Not luck, not heroics, just airflow and stone. The doorway behind the courtyard opened into a narrow hall, lined with cracked plaster and wooden beams, darkened by age. The smell of smoke drifted inside with them, carrying the scent of chemicals and wet stone. Dusty Harris and the others moved through the hall with practiced caution, boots soft against the ancient floorboards. The sergeant gestured them forward with 2 fingers, then pointed toward a stairwell where German voices echoed downward like distant conversation through pipes. The smoke still clung to their uniforms as they passed into a small parlor room where a rifle leaned against an overturned chair. A German soldier had fled moments earlier. His cigarette still burned in a clay dish on a counter. A single boot print smeared across the floor showed he had gone toward the stairs. The sergeant made a chopping motion. 2 left, 2 right. Harris, with me. No one argued. They spread into the parlor, rifles angled upward. The staircase creaked under weight above. Then came a sudden clatter, the briefest sign of panic. A German soldier stumbled into view, rifle raised too late. The 2-point squad on the right fired first. 3 controlled shots that lifted the man off his feet and dropped him down the stairs. His rifle bounced down after him, clacking against wood. The sound jolted the defenders upstairs into action. Boots stomped. A shouted order in German cut sharply down the stairwell. The sergeant fired a burst into the ceiling. Dust and fragments dropped like gray snow. Then he pointed at the bottom of the stairwell and said one word. Smoke. Dusty reached for another M18 grenade, but before he pulled it, the sergeant shook his head. No bounce. Straight drop. Harris nodded. He understood immediately. The stairwell was tight. Smoke would act differently here. Dropping it straight would choke the stairs from the bottom up, forcing the defenders either to retreat or choke with no line of sight. Dusty yanked the pin and dropped the canister at the first step. It hissed and burst again with that quiet chuff, spilling smoke that rolled upward like steam from a boiling kettle. Within seconds, white vapor filled the stairwell, trapping the Germans above. One tried to descend blindly. A rifleman to Dusty's right stepped forward and shot him point blank. The man fell limp over the stairs, collapsing like a weighted blanket. The Germans retreated into the second floor. The Americans surged upward through the smoke, hugging the railing, stepping over bodies, advancing room by room. The defenders were not prepared for an enemy who moved inside smoke, instead of waiting for it to clear. The second floor fell in less than 2 minutes. Another doorway opened to a balcony that overlooked the street from which the paratroopers had first approached. Carentan was still under fire. Other units of the 106th and 105th were pushing through narrow streets, trading shots with machine gun teams hidden in barns, attics, and behind stone fences. The sergeant scanned the town, eyes narrowing. They're dug in everywhere. If they're using the same fortifications, we'll lose half this regiment trying to clear the town." Dusty stood beside him. He didn't speak, but the sergeant turned to him as if he did. "Harris, that smoke trick. We use it again." The rifleman nearest them let out a faint laugh. "That wasn't a trick, sir. That was a miracle." Harris shook his head. "Just air trapped by stone." The sergeant stared at him. "Well, Private, let's trap it again." They cleared the building from the inside, not the courtyard. Once secured, the platoon signaled other squads from windows. They gestured directions and angles while the sergeant explained the smoke approach. He gave no speeches. He simply said, "Throw low, never high. You make the air fight for you." Within 30 minutes, 2 more squads in Carentan began using the method. Grenades rolled low across cobblestones, not lobbed. Smoke was thrown into corners, not streets. It crawled up alleyways instead of floating into the sky. Paratroopers advanced behind opaque walls of white, and German positions that had held for hours collapsed within minutes. A defensive choke point near the church bells fell after a single smoke grenade slid under a horse cart and blossomed outward. A machine gun in a butcher shop attic lost all line of sight when smoke from ground-level cracks billowed upward like a curtain. The defenders shot blindly. The attackers waited, then closed. By noon, American units were reporting successful breaches across the town. Not luck, not armor. Smoke tactics, improvised from an industrial worker's memory and a single courtyard experiment. Word traveled through radios, messengers, and shouted commands through the rain. One corporal summed it up in plain language. "Don't throw smoke at 'em, throw smoke at the ground." By afternoon, officers were asking which unit had started the method. The answer was vague until someone finally said the name with a shrug. "Some private, Harris. Dusty something." The battalion commander never learned his full name that day. He just issued new guidance for urban breach tactics. Use smoke indoors, throw low, advance blind only when the enemy blinds first. It did not read like new doctrine. It read like survival. Carentan was not won by tanks or artillery. It was won by men who learned to hide in silence behind a wall of white. And Harris, who had never called himself anything but a mill worker, watched an entire town clear one courtyard at a time, using the same airflow he had once studied in metal vents no one cared about. A pattern had been born, a method that would not yet have a name, but it would spread. Through Normandy, through Europe, through armies that did not know the man who first skipped a smoke grenade like a stone. Dusty Harris did not celebrate. He only watched the smoke thinning above the rooftops and whispered to himself, "Wrong updraft." That's the whole thing. The rain thinned as the afternoon stretched toward evening, leaving slick rooftops and puddles that reflected the dimming sky of Carentan. The church bell tower, once echoing with machine gun reports, now seemed strangely still, like a throat that had stopped shouting. American medics moved through the square, carrying stretchers over cobblestones. They passed groups of paratroopers crouched behind low stone walls, not resting, but recalculating. Platoon leaders huddled in quick circles, whispering through rain and smoke haze. They weren't talking about courage or glory. They were talking angles, airflow, drainage channels, window height versus smoke density. One sergeant tapped an old stone well with his boot. "Smoke sinks here, not drifts. It'll choke that alley if we start it low." Another paratrooper, PFC Charles Wolcott, held up a broken section of roof slate like a chalkboard, drawing crude rectangles with a piece of shell casing. Wind hits the church wall like a box, rebounds left. Grenades roll to that corner, we get a full whiteout. None of this would have made sense on the beaches 2 days earlier. None of it belonged in any infantry manual ever printed before that morning. Yet the logic spread faster than the smoke itself. The men weren't improvising anymore. They were teaching, transforming Dusty's observation into something repeatable. Inside the commandeered butcher shop, company officers relayed updates to battalion headquarters. Maps lay on the counter where carcasses had once been butchered. A radio operator wiped the grease from a sheet of butcher paper and wrote down field notes as his captain dictated. Smoke effectiveness increased in confined stone alleys. Note: throw low, aim for corners. Window line openings create draw effect, pulls haze vertically. Use that to blind upstairs positions. He paused. Write this exactly. Do not waste smoke in open streets. It's not artillery, it's airflow. The operator looked up at him like he had spoken madness. Airflow wasn't a tactical term. It was something machinists talked about in factories. Yet here it was, taking root in a war zone. Across the street, Dusty Harris sat on an overturned crate drinking water from a dented canteen. His hands shook. Not from fear now, but from exhaustion creeping back into his muscles. A medic, younger than he was, sat beside him and finally asked, "How'd you know it would work like that?" Dusty wiped sweat from the bridge of his nose. "I didn't know it would work. I just knew how air don't move in a box." The medic frowned. "A box?" Harris nodded. "Courtyard's a box. Stone keeps air trapped. Same in mills. Smoke don't escape unless there's a vent. The Germans built themselves a furnace with no chimney." The medic blinked as if that sentence rewired part of his mind. "So, the courtyard cooked them blind." "More like steamed them blind," Harris said softly. Word of the tactic reached Captain Lindley of the 106th Parachute Infantry Regiment shortly after 1400 hours. He found Harris sitting alone and approached him without ceremony. He didn't salute. He didn't offer praise. He simply asked, "Private Harris, was that deliberate or luck?" Dusty stared at him. Luck that it worked, not luck that it stayed. Lindley nodded slowly, then asked, "If we head into Saint-Côme-du-Mont tomorrow, what happens to smoke in a village with high barns and narrow alleys?" Dusty glanced at the buildings around him, studying rooftops, drainage patterns, the direction the last wisps of smoke drifted across the square. He answered like he was back in Ohio, standing over machinery. "Barns breathe. Wood lets air through. Stone stops it. Smoke sticks to stone, runs along wood. If they're dug in stone barns, choke the doors. If they're in wooden houses, smoke will vanish too fast to help." Lindley only said, "Then you'll brief the platoons tonight." That evening, under the broken rafters of the butcher shop attic, Harris stood in front of 24 men. He was not a leader. He didn't know doctrine. He didn't speak like an officer. He talked like he was explaining a fan problem on a mill floor. "Smoke is heavy when it's cold. It settles. If walls are cold too, smoke sticks to them. That's when you throw low. If walls are warm from the sun, smoke rises faster, so you throw into shade. Corners are traps. Corners make smoke stay." The men scribbled notes on ration box lids and torn paper labels. Some stared at him like he was inventing a new weapon. Others nodded because they had already felt the truth of it in their lungs earlier that day. A corporal from another company muttered, "This ain't tactics. This is plumbing." Dusty shrugged. "Everything is airflow. You breathe, guns breathe, streets breathe. Smoke just shows what air already does." Lindley stepped forward at the end and translated the lesson into soldier terms. "If stone blocks air, choke it. If wood leaks air, don't waste smoke. Control it. Don't throw blind. Make them blind first." The meeting ended with no applause, no ceremony. Men wrapped their notes into their ammo bandoliers. They didn't leave inspired. They left recalibrated. Outside patrols rotated in the damp roads as the last haze lifted over Carentan's rooftops. Somewhere in the distance, artillery crackled like thunder. Tomorrow would be another fight, another town, another box with its own airflow. Private First Class Eldon Harris would not lead it. He would only teach the men who did. Quietly, like a mill worker who had discovered the war had vents, and those vents could be turned off. Smoke, once useless, had become a weapon. And no one yet realized that this small lesson, born in a fortress courtyard, would soon spread beyond Normandy, beyond France, across Europe, across armies. It would become doctrine. But no one would ever call it the Harris method. Not yet. The sun rose the next morning with pale light pushing against low Normandy clouds. The church bells still hung crooked over the square, but the echoes of gunfire were gone. Carentan belonged to the Americans now. Engineers marked crossroads. Medics triaged the wounded beneath torn canvas sheets. Paratroopers who had slept only in fragments now stood inspecting gear that felt different in their hands, not heavier or lighter, just newly understood. No one talked about courage that morning. They talked about smoke. Corporal Myers, from Easy Company, tested throw angles beside a stable. He rolled 2 M18 grenades into the same spot, counting seconds as the haze pooled low. A staff sergeant scribbled calculations in charcoal on a barn wall. Warm roof eats fast rise. Cold corner eats cold sink. Someone else drew arrows showing smoke drift against stone buttresses. None of them knew the physics. They didn't need to. They had seen the results inside the courtyard. A lieutenant from another regiment swaggered by, smirking at the cluster of exhausted men drawing diagrams over manure-stained wood. "You boys planning to paint the place?" Myers didn't look up. "Just figuring out how to breathe indoors." The lieutenant frowned, walked away without comment. The joke was too literal. This wasn't creativity. It wasn't innovation. It was survival, turned into geometry. Inside the butcher shop, Dusty Harris sat on a crate again, watching soldiers hurry past the open doorway. He rubbed dried smoke from his sleeve, the gray residue that still clung to the folds of his uniform. His fingers kept repeating the same motion, as if expecting the fabric to stain him forever. Captain Lindley stepped in, holding a folded report. "Harris, you're being reassigned. Battalion wants you attached to headquarters for a few days. They want you describing smoke effects for urban assaults." Dusty blinked. "Sir, I'm not an instructor. I don't know." "You're not being asked what you know," Lindley interrupted. "You're being asked what you see." Outside, a jeep backfired in the street, sending 2 paratroopers diving reflexively to the ground. Neither rose immediately. They stayed still for several seconds, letting their nerves settle before laughing at themselves. Nerves did not reset with victory. They only rerouted. Harris folded the report into his pocket. It felt heavier than his rifle. He spent the next 2 days walking the streets with officers who asked him the same questions in different words. What if the enemy is above us? What if the walls aren't square? What if the wind is strong? Harris never gave poetic answers. He never speculated. He spoke like a factory worker diagnosing a jammed duct. You don't fight smoke. You guide it. If wind is strong outside, trap smoke inside. If wind is strong inside, plug the leak. If there's no wind at all, you pour smoke like water. It'll fill whatever's lowest first. Sometimes they asked where he learned this. He would shrug. I worked where air had jobs to do. By the time the paratroopers marched toward Saint-Côme-du-Mont, sections of the regiment carried smoke with intention. not as extra weight, not as a last resort, as a tactical tool, a weapon that didn't kill, but made killing possible. Dusty saw grenades counted in packs deliberately, not merely assigned. Men argued over who would carry them. Quartermasters issued more than requested. But Private First Class Harris did not lead that assault either. He walked behind the column, offering short corrections when asked, mostly unheard over the shuffle of boots and distant artillery rumble. He did not feel important. He felt useful. Useful was enough. News of Carentan spread sideways, not upward. It moved by rumor, by repetition, by the unchanged fact that soldiers talked about what kept them alive. By the time reports reached regimental command, the tactic had already mutated. Some units exaggerated it. Others misunderstood it. A lieutenant in another division wrote a field recommendation based on hearsay. Smoke grenades cause panic in German ranks. Dusty winced when he heard that. Panic hadn't won the Courtyard. Precision had. Misuse of smoke was as dangerous as neglect. Throw smoke wrong, men die blind. Throw it right, the enemy goes blind instead. Yet the official rumor became panic, as though fear, not airflow, had won the fight. Lindley overheard the comment and corrected the officer sharply. Panic's not the weapon. The walls are. The smoke just obeyed the walls. The officer scoffed, muttered something about philosophy in war. Lindley didn't answer. Dusty watched quietly, reluctant to intervene. Doctrine was a slow thing, like molten steel cooling in a mold. It hardened ugly if rushed. That night, Harris sat alone near a canal, stripping his rifle in silence. He wasn't thinking about tactics or walls or diagrams. He was thinking about iron dust falling into exhaust vents back in Ohio, about fans humming over his head like machinery that kept time. He had never trained to be a teacher, never expected that the way a room breathed could matter more than marksmanship. He finished cleaning the rifle and looked at the bridge over the canal. Water moved where air could not. Wind drifted where smoke could choke. The world could kill a man with bullets or with blindness. The battlefield was not just earth and stone. It was airflow. And he realized what he had actually done in that courtyard. He had not thrown a grenade. He had closed a vent. The courtyard had not been conquered. It had been sealed. History would never record the seal. It would record the charge, the gunfire, the victory. Officers would write reports. Historians would call it a tactical assault. But men who survived would remember something else entirely. A quiet paratrooper, staring at the air as though it were a weapon. A man who taught smoke where to go. A man who never wrote a doctrine, but made one anyway. He would never receive a medal for it. But the air around Carentan would never forget him.